We have always lived in a castle. How do I even talk about Shirley Jackson's horror classic? Well, I'll start off with the plot first. There's Mary Kate Blackwood, her sister Constance, and their uncle Julian. Years ago, there was a poisoning incident which killed the parents of the Blackwood family and left their uncle paralyzed. Constance was blamed for this. Throughout the story, the villagers have a horrible impression of them, and slowly this starts to build up. In Merricat's eyes, they're slowly rotting. This gets even worse as Charles Blackwood, their cousin, comes into play and disrupts their life. This all comes to a head as in the end, the house gets burned down by the villagers and looted. But Merricat sees this as somewhat of a gift, as now she is free to live her life in peace. So, why am I even talking about this story anyways? It's because of one thing. I love the way this story is structured. Shirley Jackson does a lot of work. There's three specific things I want to be talking about, and that would be the symbolism, the imagery, and the metaphors that they use. All of these are things that create a visual language within the story that I find really interesting and I want to talk about. Okay? So, when it comes to symbolism, there's a lot of things in the story which act as ways to get across Shirley Jackson's message. So, first thing I want to talk about would be actually two things. One would be the symbol of matriarchy, and two would be the symbols of patriarchy. So, first I'll talk about patriarchy actually. Throughout the story, there's a lot of items of material wealth. There's the staircase made of Italian wood. There's things like the watch, the chain, the silver dollars that were all previously owned by John Blackwood, the father of the house who died. These are all things that show the dominance he had over the family, the traditionally masculine power of conquest, if you will. This wealth that he can hold onto and show off. These are things that show off the symbol, a sense of power, and this is something that is also sought after by Charles Blackwood, the cousin of the Blackwood family. This is contrasted by how femininity is displayed within the story. Of course, there's things like the Dresden figures, the mother's portrait that they have in the house, and most importantly, I want to talk about is food. Food is something of a personal thing that they care for within the story. Merricat constantly buys food for Constance, and of course, Constance cooks that food, and they have this bonding time, which they explicitly they in depth they explain this type of time within the story. And this food and these other symbols, they act as somewhat of a sign of care, nurture, and love that only can come from something of a motherhood. Of course, when you combine these two contrasting ideologies, you get the conflict of the story. Charles is constantly seeking the money that was left behind by the Blackwood family, but Constance and Merricat, they just want to live their life as they are, without the influence or without the interference, actually, of the men in their house. And of course, even if it's imperfect, these things, these symbols, help highlight the theme of the difference between men and women within the story. So there's also metaphors within the story, and specifically I want to talk about the people as metaphors for a larger theme. First, there would be the men, who act as essentially metaphors for the failure of traditional masculinity to care for families. Of course, there's John Blackwood, who constantly abused Merricat and Constance, and as a show of power almost. And of course, there's also Charles Blackwood, who disrupts the peaceful life of Merricat and Constance in search for material, money, and power. Merricat's views of the village also have its own set of metaphors. Of course, the village is somewhat, I believe, a metaphor for the failure of society to care for the mentally ill. Merricat is obviously suffering from a lot of things, but the villagers, what they see is an outcast that must be pushed out. They must be exiled. Of course, in the story, there's this underlying feeling of how every villager wants them to go out. The Blackwoods must go. But This, to me, shows that Shirley Jackson was trying to tackle some sort of societal issue about how these people are not accepting of people who are not healthy or are not similar to them, how they are not accepting of these different types of people. And this metaphor is an extension of how the men in the Blackwood family don't care for their family as well. Now, the last thing I want to talk about would be imagery. Okay, so imagery is the thing that's most important of all. It's the thing that absolutely ties everything together, and it's what Shirley Jackson wants you to see. Imagery is the only thing, or not or the only thing, but is the most important thing in making the symbolism and metaphors within the story work. Of course, there's this ridiculously long imagery that Mary Cat uses to explain how she sees the world. Of course, there's the cracks in the town. She's always mentioning there's a crack in the floor with a finger pointing out. There's these bases of villagers who she believes is all rotting from the inside and dying because of the evil within their heart. There's this imagery of course, the most important thing is the imagery of the moon. Mary Cat constantly gives these long descriptions of the moon. She talks about how the moon has a house that's colored blue, where the people speak in fluent tongues. There's a garden and a fireplace full of life that she tends to. This type of imagery actually helps you, it puts you in the mindset of Mary Cat throughout the whole story as she explores this very grim world of the villagers who hate her. Mary Cat's beliefs, Mary Cat's actions, they're all fueled by the imagery that Jackson puts in. Jackson, as an author, is very competent and is able to show in detail Mary Cat's the way her mind thinks and how and why she does the things that she does. And especially when it comes to things like symbols and metaphors, the thing is that the castle and the extensive descriptions of it lends itself very well to the theme. And that's only possible because of the imagery. Especially before and after the fire, Shirley Jackson uses very different language. Before this, it was this old big house that had dust all over the place, that was still kind of well kept, but it had these lingering things that stayed from the past, like the staircase, these figures. And after the fire, the house is pretty much acts as a castle. That's where the title comes from. We have always lived in a castle. Is this house that's turreted to the sky and free for Constance and Mary Cat. This extensive use of imagery in the end is not just a literary device, it's the meat of the story. It's the thing that makes everything about the story works. It is how we see Mary Cat through text, through simple text. That's the power of words. In conclusion, I've covered around 3 things today. So first would be symbolism, then metaphor, and imagery. So these 3 things, all I believe, coalesce to make the story a great piece of literature that everybody should try and read. When it comes to symbolism, everything in the story which is inanimate has its own meaning, its own symbols, and its own contribution towards the theme of the story. When it comes to metaphor, everybody in the story acts as somewhat of a metaphor for a greater theme which exists within society. Of course, there's societal care, there's patriarchy and matriarchy through Mary Cat and Constance, as well as Julian, who as a symbol of masculinity, and he ends up dying and being left in the past, as well as everybody else in the Blackwoods, except for Constance and Mary Cat. There's also imagery, which ties everything together so beautifully. It's an art of words that Shirley Jackson is using to express the story that she has in her mind. And through Mary Cat, we get to see, even if the world is somewhat twisted, it's still beautiful in some sort of way. She says that the moon is a beautiful place. Even if it's this like isolated, separate place, there's still a beauty in how Shirley Jackson is able to use that. I believe all these things combined make We Have Always Lived in a Castle just a really good story. It's just great. And I recommend you read it yourself. Thank you for your time.